Brothers and sisters, the world just shook. Not in Washington, not in Paris, not in New York, but in Ouagadougou, the beating heart of Africa, where Captain Ibrahim Traoré has just unleashed a move no one saw coming. In a single announcement, he declared the birth of something the West never imagined. An African Security Council, not run by the old empires, not controlled by foreign powers, but led by 5 African leaders who have sworn to defend their people and their continent. Think about that for a moment. For decades, the United Nations told us who could speak, who could decide, who could veto. 5 powers at a table, 4 of them Western, 1 of them Eastern, dictating the destiny of the world. But today, brothers and sisters, a new table has been built, and it does not stand in New York. It stands in Africa. The question that shakes every palace in the West is this: is this the first crack in the wall of global power? And the question for us, for Africans, for the black world, for everyone who dares to dream of freedom, is even greater. What happens if this council succeeds? Stay with me, because the story I'm about to tell you is not just politics. It is prophecy. Brothers and sisters, picture this. Ouagadougou, a city heavy with dust, heavy with expectation. The sun was sliding low, painting the sky in the deep red of the Sahel. Soldiers lined the streets, not with fear, but with discipline, as if they were preparing for a moment that would be etched into history. The air buzzed, not with gunfire this time, but with whispers. Something was about to happen. Inside the presidential hall, Captain Ibrahim Traoré walked to the podium. No gold curtains, no marble stage, just a wooden desk, microphones, and the flags of 5 nations standing tall behind him: Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Guinea. And one more banner that made the crowd lean forward, a new flag stitched only days before, symbolizing unity. Traoré looked into the cameras, his face steady, his uniform plain, and his words electric. He did not read a script. He did not beg for recognition. He declared in a voice that shook the walls, "For too long, Africa's security has been decided in foreign capitals. Tonight, we announce the birth of our own shield, our own voice, our own council, the African Security Council." The room froze. Outside, the crowd erupted like thunder, and across the oceans in Washington and Paris, screens lit up with breaking news. Analysts scrambled for explanations. Diplomats whispered, "What is he doing?" But Traoré kept speaking, and every sentence was a blow against the old order. He said the council would be made up of 5 African leaders, chosen not for wealth or status, but for their commitment to sovereignty. 5 voices, 1 table, 1 mission, to defend Africa against terrorism, against coups, against exploitation, and against the silence that had buried the continent's cries for decades. And who were these 5? That question burned in every journalist's mind. Traoré began to name them. The first, a leader hardened by war in the Sahel. The second, a civilian president who had survived assassination attempts. The third, a general who had once been trained abroad but now turned his back on the West. The fourth, a revolutionary whose speeches could ignite whole cities. And the fifth, himself, Captain Traoré, the youngest of them all, but the one who dared to call this council into being. Each name struck like a drumbeat. Each introduction carried the weight of a new dawn. And as he spoke, the symbolism became impossible to miss. For generations, the world had accepted the United Nations Security Council, 5 permanent seats, most of them Western, with the power to veto the world's future. But here, at last, Africa was answering back. 5 leaders, 5 nations, 5 voices that could not be silenced. The announcement was not just political, It was spiritual. In the crowd, elders wept. Youth chanted. Some lifted their fists, others raised their phones, recording history in real time. For them, it was more than a council. It was the first time they saw Africa building its own fortress instead of borrowing the shields of others. But it wasn't only joy. There was fear, too. In the back rows, diplomats from foreign embassies exchanged uneasy looks. Reporters scribbled furiously. Would this council be recognized internationally? Was it legal? Was it dangerous? And somewhere, in offices thousands of miles away, men in suits were already dialing numbers, asking their intelligence officers, "Who is behind this? How far will they go?" Traoré knew all this. That is why he ended with words designed to echo far beyond Burkina Faso. "We are not asking for permission. We are not seeking approval. We are exercising our right to exist, to protect, and to lead. Africa will no longer wait for others to decide when we live or die. The African Security Council begins now." The hall erupted. Soldiers banged their rifles against the floor. The crowd outside chanted one word over and over: "Africa! Africa! Africa!" And so, brothers and sisters, in that single evening, a page turned. The African Security Council was born. Not in secret negotiations in Geneva, not in marble halls in New York, but in the raw, sun-baked capital of Burkina Faso. It was an act of defiance, yes, but it was also an act of creation, the creation of a seat at the world's table that no one had offered, a seat Africa had pulled out for itself. That was the night Africa held its breath. That was the night the world realized the rules of the game were changing. Brothers and sisters, the ink on Traoré's declaration had not even dried before the tremors began. News agencies scrambled for headlines. CNN called it a reckless gamble. Le Monde in Paris labeled it an illusion of power. The BBC tried to soften it, a symbolic move, unlikely to change realities on the ground. But make no mistake, behind those carefully chosen words was raw panic. Because every capital city in the West understood, this was no mere speech. This was a challenge to the very architecture of global power. Washington's first call. In the White House Situation Room, aides rushed in with urgent updates. "He's calling it the African Security Council," one reported. "5 leaders, independent structure, claims sovereignty." The president frowned. Is this Russian-backed? Chinese-backed? The question itself revealed the fear that Africa could act on its own. Within hours, the U.S. State Department issued a statement. The United States recognizes the importance of African unity, but urges Burkina Faso and its partners to work within existing international institutions. In other words, stay in the box we built for you. Paris trembles. If Washington was nervous, Paris was furious. France, the former colonial ruler, still saw the Sahel as its sphere of influence. To hear that 5 African nations were forming their own Security Council without French blessing was a humiliation. Behind closed doors, French officials warned, "This cannot stand. We will not allow parallel institutions to destabilize the region." And yet, brothers and sisters, destabilization was precisely what they feared. Because once African nations start to build their own structures, the old dependency chains begin to crack. Brussels and the European Union. The EU followed with concern. Diplomats whispered about sanctions, about cutting aid, about isolating these 5 nations. But even as they threatened punishment, they knew the truth. Every sanction breeds resistance. Every attempt to isolate fuels solidarity. Inside Africa. 2 faces of reaction. But what about Africa itself? That, brothers and sisters, was where the real drama unfolded. In Bamako, the capital of Mali, the announcement was met with celebrations. Crowds gathered in the squares, waving flags, chanting Traoré's name. Radio stations replayed his words on loop as if they were scripture. In Niamey, Niger's youth lit bonfires declaring, for the first time, Africa is speaking for Africa. But in other capitals, Dakar, Abidjan, Nairobi, leaders were cautious. Some feared that joining such a bold project would bring the wrath of the West. Others doubted whether Traoré had the resources to sustain this dream. Behind closed doors, phone calls crackled. Should we join? Should we wait? Or should we distance ourselves? The media storm. On social media, the news spread like wildfire. Hashtags exploded. African Security Council, Traoré challenge. Africa rises. Young Africans in Lagos, Johannesburg, Kinshasa posted videos declaring support. We need this. Enough is enough. At the same time, Western pundits flooded the airwaves. This is unrealistic. This is dangerous. This could invite military escalation. But the louder the critics shouted, the more people tuned in. Because deep down, the world knew. If Africa could sustain such a council, it would rewrite centuries of dependency. The unseen fear. Behind every statement, every press release, lay a deeper fear, the fear of a precedent. If Africa could build its own council, what would stop Asia from doing the same? What would stop Latin America from creating its own Security Council? What would stop the Global South from saying, we no longer accept the monopoly of the United Nations Security Council? This, brothers and sisters, was why the reaction was so intense. It wasn't about Burkina Faso alone. It was about the domino effect. Traoré's response. And when reporters asked Traoré about the backlash, his answer was blunt. They said we could not govern without them. They said we could not defend ourselves without them. But brothers and sisters, look at us now. We are not begging for a seat in their hall. We are building our own hall. Those words only deepened the divide. To some, they sounded like a declaration of war against the old order. To others, they were the sweetest words they had ever heard. So the shock waves spread from Washington to Paris, from African streets to global headlines. The world was no longer asking if Traoré had shaken the system. The world was now asking, how far will this go? And that question, brothers and sisters, leads us directly into the next part of our story, the consequences. Because a declaration like this does not just echo in the air. It brings real changes, real risks, and real opportunities. Brothers and sisters, words are powerful. But when words come from the mouth of a head of state, backed by soldiers, flags, and the fire of a continent's hope, they do not remain words. They become actions. They become consequences. And that night, after Traoré announced the birth of the African Security Council, consequences began to unfold like a chain of falling dominoes. Burkina Faso. From the margins to the spotlight, first at home. Burkina Faso, a country that many in the world could barely locate on a map, suddenly stood at the center of global headlines. The streets of Ouagadougou erupted in pride. Young men painted their faces with the colors of the national flag. Women danced in the marketplaces saying, "Our children will grow up with dignity." Even the old, who had lived through decades of coup, corruption, and foreign interference, whispered, "Maybe this time it is different." For Traoré, this was a turning point. No longer just a transitional leader of a poor Sahelian nation, he became the face of defiance, the symbol of a continent rising, the ripple in the African Union. But the ripple did not stop there. In Addis Ababa, the headquarters of the African Union, phones rang without pause. Some officials argued, "We cannot recognize this council. It undermines our own institutions." Others countered, "But the people are demanding it. If we ignore it, We risk becoming irrelevant. The African Union found itself trapped. On one hand, they feared alienating the West, whose funding still kept many AU programs alive. On the other hand, they could not ignore the roar of support from African streets. The African Security Council was not just an idea anymore. It was a movement, and movements are harder to control than institutions, the first decisions of the council. Meanwhile, the 5 leaders did not wait for permission. Within days, they announced their first resolutions: Joint Defense Pact. An attack on one member would be treated as an attack on all. Resource Protection Charter. African gold, uranium, and oil could no longer be exploited without the consent of the people. Anti-coup framework. To intervene jointly if foreign-backed coups threatened member states. These resolutions were simple on paper, but their symbolism was explosive. For the first time, African leaders were declaring not only their right to speak, but their right to enforce. The streets across the continent in Lagos, youth organizations marched with banners: One Africa, One Security Council. In Johannesburg, students painted murals of the 5 leaders as superheroes. In Kinshasa, church choirs inserted Traoré's words into their hymns. The continent was waking up. Even in countries whose leaders hesitated to endorse the council, the people were pushing. And that, brothers and sisters, is when leaders truly feel the heat, not from foreign ambassadors, but from their own citizens demanding change. The Western response grows sharper. But for the West, these consequences were unacceptable. France quietly began withdrawing investment projects from Burkina Faso. American advisors warned regional allies not to fall into Traoré's trap. Aid packages were delayed. Rumors swirled of covert plans to destabilize the 5 nations. The same old playbook dusted off again. And yet, the more they tried to squeeze, the more the council gained credibility, because every punitive measure confirmed what Traoré had said. They do not want us independent. They want us dependent. A double-edged sword. But brothers and sisters, let us not romanticize too quickly. Consequences are not only victories, they are also burdens. By declaring this council, Traoré and his allies painted targets on their backs. Intelligence reports hinted at assassination plots. Rumors of coups began to circulate again in the Sahel. Some African leaders warned, if you provoke too much, you may bring chaos to us all. Even within the member states, doubts simmered. Could they fund joint military operations? Could they withstand sanctions? Could 5 leaders, each with different personalities and pressures, stay united when the storm grew stronger? The symbol that cannot be erased. Yet, even with these risks, the symbol was already alive, and symbols, once born, are difficult to kill. Children in Burkina Faso began sketching the council's flag in their schoolbooks. Activists in Ghana, Senegal, and Tanzania demanded their governments consider joining. Diaspora communities in London and New York held rallies declaring, Africa will defend itself. So the consequences, brothers and sisters, were not just diplomatic, they were psychological. They shifted the imagination of a continent, and once the imagination shifts, history follows. That is why we must now turn to the wider world. Because if Africa was stirred, if the people were awakened, then the question was inevitable. What would America, Europe, Russia, and China do now? That, brothers and sisters, is the story of our next chapter. Brothers and sisters, when the African Security Council was born, it was not only Africa that trembled. The whole world tilted its head, watching closely, calculating, whispering behind closed doors. The American lens. In Washington, the mood was clear: suspicion. For decades, U.S. strategy in Africa had been simple: counterterrorism, secure resources, limit rivals. The African Security Council threatened all 3. At the Pentagon, generals frowned. A council with its own defense pact meant African armies might one day say no to foreign bases. At the State Department, diplomats asked nervously, "What if more nations join? What if they demand we leave Sahel entirely?" Yet even as they condemned Traoré's recklessness, some American analysts admitted something dangerous. He is popular. His words resonate. This is not just politics, this is movement. And movements, once they catch fire, are harder to bomb than armies. France's nightmare. If Washington was worried, Paris was humiliated. France had long claimed to be the guardian of Sahel stability. But now, here was a young captain, tossing aside decades of French influence with a single declaration. French newspapers were brutal. An anti-French alliance. Former officials warned, if this council succeeds, France will lose its last stronghold in Africa. Behind the headlines, French intelligence agencies dusted off their old playbooks, fund opposition groups, pressure neighboring states, whisper about coups. For them, this was not just politics. It was survival of influence. China and Russia, silent smiles. But in Moscow and Beijing, the reaction was different. They watched with cautious smiles. Russia, already building ties in Mali and Burkina Faso, saw opportunity. An African Security Council independent of the West could be a door for Moscow to expand influence, to sell weapons, to strike deals, to gain allies in the global South. Kremlin spokesmen said little, but their silence was approval. China, meanwhile, played its usual long game. Publicly, it said, "We support African solutions to African problems." But privately, Chinese strategists calculated, if Africa can organize its own council, Beijing's Belt and Road projects will have a more stable shield. Less Western interference, more room for Chinese partnerships. The United Nations, shaken foundations. And then, brothers and sisters, there was the United Nations. For decades, the Security Council in New York had been the throne of global authority. But here was Africa declaring its own. Diplomats worried. If this model spreads, the UN could lose legitimacy. Imagine an Asian Security Council, a Latin American Security Council, regional councils everywhere. The monopoly of 5 veto powers would crumble. So the UN tried to dismiss it. Symbolic, aspirational, not legally binding. But even as they dismissed it, they knew. Symbols can be more powerful than laws. The Global South, a spark of hope. Elsewhere in the world, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in the Caribbean, activists whispered, "If Africa can do it, why not us?" For the first time, the idea of a multipolar world felt tangible, not theoretical. Brothers and sisters, this is why the reaction from world powers was mixed. Fear from the West, opportunity for the East, curiosity from the South. Because the African Security Council was more than a structure. It was a mirror, and in that mirror, every region of the world saw its own possible future. And so we arrive at the next stage of our story. The world had reacted. The consequences were real. But now came the hardest part, the road ahead. Could the African Security Council survive the storm? Could 5 leaders hold the line against pressure from every direction? Brothers and sisters, the birth of the African Security Council shook the world. The reactions were loud. The consequences were swift. But the deeper question now lingers like a drumbeat in the Sahel night. Can it last? Can it grow? The storms to come. Make no mistake. The road ahead will not be paved with roses. Already whispers of sabotage hang in the air. Western capitals discuss sanctions, aid cuts, and pressure campaigns. Intelligence agencies sharpen their knives, speaking of regime change in quiet rooms. And inside Africa itself, cracks may appear. 5 leaders, 5 nations, 5 egos. Unity is never easy. What happens when resources run low? When one leader faces a coup at home? When foreign powers try to buy one member away from the table? These are storms waiting just beyond the horizon. The weight of responsibility. But brothers and sisters, responsibility is the price of greatness. By declaring this council, Traoré and his allies have lifted not just their nations, but the hopes of millions. The youth of Africa are watching. The diaspora across the oceans is watching. Even the enemies of Africa are watching, waiting for the first mistake. Every decision the council makes will echo louder than its size. Every success will inspire millions. Every failure will be magnified by those who pray for its collapse. Seeds of opportunity. Yet within these challenges lie seeds of opportunity. Imagine, for the first time, African armies coordinating without foreign command. Imagine African resources negotiated through one voice, not scattered deals signed in secret. Imagine coups stopped before they start, because Africa finally has its own shield. Yes, the money is limited. Yes, the weapons are few, but history has never been made by those who waited until they were ready. History is made by those who dare to move when the world tells them to sit still. The vision beyond. Today. If the African Security Council survives its infancy, the next decade could look different. Other nations may join. A rotating chair could give every African state a voice. Partnerships with Asia and Latin America could strengthen its independence. And one day, brothers and sisters, when the United Nations debates war and peace, Africa may no longer knock at the door. It may sit proudly as an equal, backed by its own council, its own power. This is not just politics. This is destiny unfolding. The people's role. But destiny, brothers and sisters, is never guaranteed. It depends on the people. Will Africans defend this council when it is attacked? Will they hold their leaders accountable when temptations of corruption or division arise? Will they choose unity over division, faith over fear? Because in the end, councils and institutions are only reflections of the people who believe in them. If Africans believe this is their moment, no empire can erase it. If Africans doubt, the dream will crumble like dust in the wind. And so the road ahead is both peril and promise. The African Security Council stands at a crossroads, fragile yet powerful, attacked yet alive, doubted yet unstoppable in spirit. The story is not finished. In fact, it has only just begun. Brothers and sisters, we have walked through the moment of birth. We have seen the shock waves. We have traced the consequences. We have watched the world react, and we have stood at the crossroads of destiny. And now we arrive at the question that cannot be avoided. What happens next? For generations, Africa was told, wait your turn, sit at the back, accept what is given. The world built a table in New York, and they told us, this is the only table that matters. But tonight, we know another table has been built, not of marble and glass, but of courage and sacrifice, not in the halls of empire, but in the dust of Ouagadougou. The African Security Council is not perfect. It is fragile. It is untested. But so was every revolution that ever changed the course of history. The American Revolution began with farmers holding muskets. The liberation of Haiti began with enslaved men and women rising in the night. The independence of Ghana began with dreamers who refused to believe in chains. Why should Africa's rebirth be any different? Already the world is watching, some with fear, some with anger, some with hope. But none can ignore it. And that, brothers and sisters, is already a victory. Because for the first time in living memory, Africa is not begging for a seat at someone else's council. Africa is standing up, declaring, we will decide our own fate. So I ask you, where will you stand when history calls? Will you stand with those who doubt? those who fear, those who cling to the past? Or will you stand with those who dare to dream, those who dare to build, those who dare to protect Africa's tomorrow? Because this is not just Traoré's story. This is not just the story of 5 leaders. This is your story, my story, the story of every man, woman, and child who has ever prayed that Africa might rise again. Brothers and sisters, history is unfolding before our very eyes. Do not watch it from the sidelines. Walk with it, stand with it, live it. And if you believe, if you truly believe that Africa has the right to its own shield, its own voice, its own counsel, then do not stay silent. Subscribe. Share this message. Let the world know the African Security Council has begun, and nothing will ever be the same again, because the old order trembles, the new order rises, and the only question left is this: which side of history will you stand on?